she encouraged me to start doing more. But I was a little feeling a little disenfranchised from the whole thing because, people would say certain things very assertively. Here's how it is in Agile. I'm like, I've not seen it work that way. And I try to engage with that conversation. And sometimes people would get quite almost aggressive on social media about, no, this is how it is. One of the arguments I'd often find myself drawn into is people would say, oh, user stories don't work. And I'm like, well, what does that look like to you? Oh, well, it's when you do this and this. I'm like, that's not how I learned it back in the early 2000s. So there's often another one, I suppose, at the moment, which might be controversial for some, is SAFe. SAFe is, even when you look at it, it's essentially, it presents itself even as a series of mini waterfalls generally. And I'm like, it doesn't have to look that way. I can imagine how it's more agile for some companies than what they may have had, but it doesn't feel very agile to me. And sometimes having conversations with people about SAFe and what that looks like relative to the agility that I've learned over the last 23 years. Yeah, my first XP project was in the year 2000. It just looks very different to me, and sometimes I feel, oh, am I the one who's not getting it? I'm going crazy. And I speak to some of my other friends and colleagues who've been in the agile game for even longer than me, and they're like, no, yeah, that's how I feel about these things too. And I'm like, okay, so it's not just me then. So I feel it's this, there's a difficulty with engaging in certain parts of the community where people have got a very rigid idea of what agility looks like, whereas mine is a little more vague. Not vague, that's not the right word. Flexible, a little more flexible, with boundaries.
Yeah, I have seen that as well. And I think the challenging part is to continue the conversation. If you want to, but others don't, then it's like, how can we ever come to some middle ground understanding, respecting each other's ideas and that kind of thing. So I can see that definitely is continuing to be challenging for sure.
Yeah, and one of the things I always say is, I probably had some of these thoughts myself back in the earlier days, but I've had time to constantly evolve and build upon that earlier understanding. So I'm not, this is one of the things that I always try to avoid, is to sound like I've always known it this way, because I haven't.
Right.
How I understand things today is slightly different to how I understood things yesterday. And when you have enough days, you can go back far enough and find that actually I probably had exactly that same opinion when I was at a similar
Right.
stage of my journey. Although I do think there's one very different thing, and I talked about this in a video on my company's YouTube channel, RiverGlide TV. I think back in the early days, I suppose I was among the early adopters, and in those days, it was such a small community that if you were in a discussion on one of the mailing lists, you literally had the people like Kent Beck and Rachel Davies on that mailing list, and they would engage with you there and then. And I'm hearing directly from the people who either came up with some of these practices or refined them and improved and built upon them. Whereas today, everyone's kind of getting it from their team leader, who got it from their team leader, who got it from their team leader. And over time, there's going to be this natural, the broken telephone game, this natural evolution of the message, but not necessarily in the right direction. And that's just going to happen with any idea. I think, as something like the ideas behind Agile have grown massively, it's basically just the way companies are trying to do things now. Back then, it was, I think, in the UK, most of the people working on any kind of, agile or XP project back then, like, we all knew each other because it was such a small community. Whereas now, who knows how that person learned it? Could have been from anywhere. And it's interesting. You can always tell, in my sort of journeys as in my coaching capacity, you can always tell when people have had exposure to the people who've understood the entire thread of the journey of these ideas from the early days to now, because you can just hear how they speak is very different. It's not about absolutes. It's always about these, the context.
It depends.
It does,
right? Yeah, I totally get that. And so from that experience and perspective, what kind of advice would you give up and coming Black Agilists or entering this space?
Well, I will separate that into two parts. I will say, for any Agilist, I think it's important to understand some of the history of the ideas that you're being asked to work to. Where did that idea come from? How did it get there? Because then you'll start to see where actually this is an evolution of an old idea, or a new explanation of this older idea that has improved upon it, given us some new analogies to work to help us understand. Or if it's actually something that's maybe come from a different path, which might have come from a consultancy that wants to jump on the bandwagon and make as much money as possible and package things up in a way that is attractive to a large enterprise. Understanding where these ideas came from, it is quite important. So I think it's important to read some of the original books on many of these ideas, and know that we've got many better explanations now than then, but follow that path. There's one good example is some of the teams that I encounter are using, or say they're using, behavior-driven development, or BDD, but what they're doing isn't really BDD as I see it. But if you then trace it back, well, who first talked about BDD? Well, it was Dan North. And what did he say? He said, well, I needed to engage with some developers around test-driven development, but at the time, as soon as they heard the word test, they said, that's not our problem, it's those testers over there. So he had to come up with a way of engaging with them around how could I get them to even be open to a conversation? I'll just replace the word T with a different word. And he said, well, behavior-driven development. Yeah, we're going to try this thing called behavior-driven development. And they'd be like, oh yeah, okay. Yeah, what's that? He said, oh, well, it's when you essentially are specifying the behavior of the software that you're creating. And they'd be like, oh yeah, that sounds like something we should be doing. Said, and we're going to do it in a way where the specification automatically checks that the software conforms to it once we get it working. Oh, that sounds really clever. Let's try that. So that was how it started. Mm-hmm. And it grew out of his desire at the time to try and better explain test-driven development. There were elements of test-driven development that people would say were, oh, it's just this red-green refactor loop. And actually, even in the first TDD book, right at the back in the section Mastering TDD, Kent talks about this idea of the customer tests, and just said he hadn't really found a very good way of doing it yet, but other people had found good ways, and pointed to people like Ward Cunningham at the time. And later on, some other people talked about this concept of the outer and the inner loop of TDD, and he wanted to try and get that point across in a different way. And it just, as a result of coming up with this new name, he openly said he was using it to start a dialogue. And under that brand, it allowed him to completely reframe TDD in different words that people would be more receptive to at that time. And so then you start to realize that actually, when people talk about writing their BDDs, you realize, well, actually, that's not really it. And then you look at it and it's, well, that's just the customer spec element. It misses out the inner loop of BDD. So it's about, if you follow the path back, you get back to the origins and you start to realize actually it wasn't just about the customer scenarios. He was essentially trying to find a new and improved way to help people first engage with TDD where they weren't at the time, because the word test wasn't cool back then, and how to take some of the concepts that were almost not very well explained and make them a bit more explicit and a bit more obvious, because he had to learn a lot of these things the hard way. So that's one example of just tracing it all the way back to the origin, and then starting to realize what the intent of that practice was. And then you can start to see, well, how could that be useful to me in my context today? As opposed to just doing a practice that someone's tried to show you. As for Black Agilists, I think it's very difficult to answer that question broadly, because one of the things that really came out when April and I were facilitating the growing racial equity in the Agile community in 2020 was how different everyone's experience is globally. And obviously this is a global conversation. The experience in the UK is very different to the US. It's different in different parts of the UK. It's going to be different in different parts of the US. It's different in the Caribbean. It's different in Africa. It's different all over the world. So I don't know if I can give any one piece of advice, but I suppose the thing that I would take away from my personal experience that hopefully others can borrow, that if you find yourself in a situation where it feels like you're maybe not being heard, or you're being spoken over, or the person stares at you because they weren't expecting you to be different to them based on the telephone conversation you had or whatever, I've always tried to keep telling myself, that's not me. That's not my issue in here. It's a problem that they've got. It's a bias that they have that they don't realize that they've got. And I try my hardest to be sympathetic to them not knowing any better, and rather than get angry. And the reason I personally do that is partly because I had to learn to do that, because when you start work in the UK in the 90s in an office, you kind of have to learn to find a way of coping. But also, I think it puts you in a position where you can more calmly engage with that person, and there's more potential to try and get that person to see the bias. I had this exact thing happen some time ago. I was in an office with a client, and one of the people in the room was talking about, I don't know, something to do with someone's hair. And back in the day, I used to have cane row. I used to, the cornrow, I suppose, in America, right? Yeah. And my hair was very long, and it was always cornrowed in different designs. I think April's seen the pictures. And I mentioned, I used to have long hair myself. I used to have it in these cornrow designs. And somebody said, I don't know if we'd have hired you if you'd have had that hairstyle. And I was like, well, why would that be? Immediately, I realized, I caught myself, and I said, I don't want to punish this person for getting this wrong. I want to understand, help them see that there was a little bias there that they might want to be aware of. And by being sympathetic to them not knowing any better, it resulted in a very short conversation where I said, well, if that was me, then if that was the case, I probably would have had a lucky escape and avoided working for a company that allows racial bias. And they went, yeah, good point. And everything was smoothed over. Whereas if I'd got upset and angry about it, then I might have responded differently, and they might become more defensive, and then nothing would have improved. But at least now they probably will catch themselves in the future and realize that that's something that is not acceptable, to be biased towards someone just because they choose, because the culture they come from has a particular hairstyle.
Yeah.
So try to be sympathetic as much as you can. I think it gets us further in the conversation than getting angry.
Agree. I
Oh,
think
one other thing, get a really good friend. So that afterwards, you can call them up and say, April, you're not going to believe what just happened in the office. Oh,
yeah, you got to get it out somehow.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I think I know for myself, it's definitely a process to evolve to that, to immediately go to the place of curiosity and to highlight the bias without all of the other emotions that are like bubbling up inside you. So you save that for later. Save that for April. I wanted to take a quick pause and just let anybody who is on the call, if you have questions for Antony, please put them in the chat, do a raise hand or something to let me know since I'm kind of handling it all on my own. Because I want you to have the opportunity to ask him questions as well as the questions that I have for him. So just putting that out there.
And are people able to comment in the chat? So if they do have a question, they can write it in the chat or stand up to speak.
Yeah, whichever is most comfortable for you, whether you want to put it in the chat or if you want to say it out loud yourself, by all means, we are here to have the conversation. So, oh, I see a hand. Karen, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anthony, for coming. My question to you would be, so what would be that moment that you are most proud of throughout your career, especially in the Agile space?
Oh, actually, it was something that I did, I suppose, professionally speaking. In terms of the work I do with my clients, I think it was some work I did with Ford actually some years ago, where they were first moving towards selling vehicles on the internet, and some of the old systems that managed the journey of a vehicle through its manufacture, shipping, and delivery were probably not built with e-commerce in mind. And we managed to put together a team of 4 people, who I'd been coaching previously, but I then kind of took on a more of a team leader role, and we were able to prove that, a lot of the ideas that we'd been able to do a few of in the past, if you put them all together, amazing things happen. And we ended up with, we were doing TDD, both the outer loop and the inner loop, and ended up doing CDC as well, so consumer driven contracts, and a very loosely coupled event driven microservices architecture, where the microservices were actual microservices, not just in name, but literally the code was like that much per service in terms of the logic of the service. We did trunk based development. We were committing and pushing numerous times an hour, and I think at one point we were shipping to production around 20 times a day. And from the time you commit and push to it being in production was about 20 minutes. And in a whole year's worth of development, that platform had something like 6 production defects that were all minor and fixed within less than an hour. So I think in terms of, it was one of those opportunities I was given to, put my money where my mouth is and say, okay, if you think all this stuff can really work, show us. And I have to commend the management team at Ford, who created an environment where we could just get on and just do it. And because of the imperative of being able to manage these vehicles through online and e-commerce, I think that gave us a lot of freedom. And I suppose they liked that a lot, because after I finished working with that team, about a year later, they asked me to come back and help them build a new company called Ford Digital. which I started doing 4 days a week on a couple of months ago as head of engineering. And I was its first employee, and I just hired my first software engineer, and we're growing the company from there. So I suppose that from a professional point of view. But I think in terms of personal at work, there have been numerous times where people have said that they'd completely lost their passion for their work. They started in the space of product development or software development or testing or any one of the areas of expertise, and they said they'd kind of lost the passion, and the reason they got into it in the first place had gone, and they were just collecting their paycheck. And helping them come back from that to start rediscovering why they got involved in the first place, and helping teams create a space where the people that are there because they originally were passionate about what they did got to be passionate about it and enjoy it again. And there's so many people over the years that I've sort of had those experiences with. And those are the moments that for me really underpin my purpose and helped me realize that why I do what I do is to help bring joy back into people's work. That's the real motivation for me, because different people start their working lives for different reasons. Some people choose the path they go down because, oh well, I heard there's a good paycheck, so I'm going to study for that profession, get that job, and get the good paycheck. And but I think in our field, a lot of people find their way here. A lot of people that I know, particularly people who are doing. Okay, so for my story, I started writing code when I was 10, and I loved it, and I kept doing it all throughout my teens and all throughout my 20s and 30s and 40s, and getting to do something that I loved was really important. And some people start on the path because they loved it, and they lose that love through having experiences where they can't do things as well as they want to because there's too much time pressure, so they have to cut corners and all of these other things. Then there's some people that stumble into it through another profession, or some people that came because they wanted a good paycheck and it wasn't really the subject or the work itself they were interested in, it was the paycheck. But then helping them find the things that they love about it in that process as well. So those are the overall experiences, and there wasn't any one particular one that I would say, yeah, that's the one that I'm most proud of. But whenever those conversations happen where someone says I've found joy in my work again, that's gives me the real buzz.
All right,
Awesome.
I see
Thank
Mari
you.
has. Thanks, Karen. I see Mari has her hand up.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Hi, Anthony.
Hello.
What you just shared definitely resonated with me. Finding, helping your colleagues enjoy the work that they do. I just finished reading this book.
Joy
and it's
Inc.
exactly that. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it or not. Joy Inc. by Richard Sheridan. I highly recommend it. And it was just the same thing. He's a developer, and he enjoyed developing since he was a teen. And through his experiences, he was losing the joy. And he decided to create his own company. And he shares experiences. It's a fantastic narrative. It actually helped me learn about XP because I'm relatively new in the Agile environment. It's absolutely fabulous. I highly, highly recommend it. Really good.
I love that. I'm going to read it, see what other experiences and perspectives I can take from that, because that's what I've been asked to do with For Digital is help create that place that people can find the joy in their work and get to do amazing things and be motivated by the work itself, and try to get everything else out of their way. So I'm sure that'll be a valuable source of information and ideas.
Thanks, Mari. All right, so in all of these experiences and in just your whole span of your career, what has been the best career advice you've ever received.
There's one piece of advice that I got my very, very first job at British Telecom. Well, my second job at British Telecom. And there was a manager there. And one of the things that he said to me, he said, it's as important to do a good job as it is to be seen to do a good job. He said, if you spend all of your energy just doing a good job, you can't assume that it's going to be noticed. So make sure that you socialize what you're doing and the successes that you're having as much as you possibly can. And I took that always stuck with me, That was in, I think 1998. I heard that. I'm pretty sure that's how significant it was. And it was from a guy called Bill Walker. I don't imagine he'll watch this, but if he ever does, then I remember you saying this to me. And that's really stuck with me because it tied in a lot with, again, the advice that my dad had given me, that, if you're probably going to have to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good. And I realized that actually I also need to be seen. And it was not long after that I started to actually go to conferences and start to watch people give talks. And we didn't have like meetups as such back then. There were kind of sort of meetups happening, and just getting out there and meeting more people. And then one day I was having a conversation in a break at a conference, and somebody said, "Oh, what did you think of that talk?" And I said, "Oh, here's some of my thoughts, but I've had a different experience. My experience looks like this." And they said, "Oh, well, you should give a talk about that." And I was like, "Oh, I'm too early in my career. I'm not worthy." It was like, no. You should just tell your story. It's your experience. And I was like, yeah, I guess no one can disagree with the experience I had, because it was my experience and I was the one that was there. I'm not going to go up there and say, here's how anyone else should do it. I'm just going to say, here's what happened in this story. And eventually I got round to starting to speak at a couple of conferences in exactly that way, and started to be seen outside of work as well as inside that particular workplace. I used to try and share things with my colleagues as much as possible. If I found a way of doing things, I'd try to work collaboratively rather than competitively. And that resulted in me being the person that people would often then come to, because they thought, well, if he doesn't know, he probably knows someone who does know how to do that. Right. Because I'd always say, hey, I've learned this new thing, and sharing it with my colleagues. And then I think 2004, I started a blog called Testing Reflections, which was about inspired by test-driven development as a concept, but all the things around it. And at the time, there's quite a lot of tension, if you like, between many developers and testers in the community, as people were trying to understand how they fit into this new world of Agile with TDD, with far more automation around testing than was ever there before. And I wanted to try and bring people together. So I started I started out as a blog aggregator and a blog hosting website, because there wasn't really anywhere for technical people really to host a blog at the time. And that grew quite big. And off the back of that, I ended up, some of the articles that I wrote on there ended up getting featured in a few different places and mentioned in a few books. So I think, sharing your experience outside also is a part of that, being seen to be doing a good job. But I suppose the hidden piece of advice in that is also, if you're sharing your experience and your journey and not trying to tell anyone the right or wrong way to do things, then it seems that people are more open to listening, and because you're just telling your story, right, and not saying that this is the only way, this is what happened in this situation at that time for me. That's one of the best ways to get started, and that's what I started doing on my blog, just keeping a journal of what I've been learning about that week, the book I read, or the insight that I got from something, and that would spark a conversation. And I've tried as much as possible to stick to that. This is my experience, as opposed to here's how you do this practice.
Right. That's great advice for anybody who is trying to get into that space. I totally agree, because I remember when I would talk to my colleagues who were already speaking at conferences, and I was just like, I don't know what I can talk about. Everything's been talked about already. And she said the same thing as you did, just share your experience, because that's unique to you. Nobody can have had the same experience. And if they did, in some shape or form, they will be able to relate to you. And, another thought related to that was, sometimes you're the voice they need to hear the message from. It might have been said before in some shape or form, but you are the conduit that message needs to come through in order for it to translate for people. So
yeah, it could be the right voice in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
I mean, as you just saying that, it reminds me, there was a tweet the other day that was talking about how a tech leader told one of their juniors, that there's no point in them starting a blog because they haven't got anything to share yet. And I immediately jumped in and said, actually, it's one of the best ways of learning is by writing things down. And at the time, I hadn't heard of Richard Feynman, a physicist, for anyone that doesn't know, who was called the Great Explainer. And what came about from his learning style was something called the Feynman technique. And it doesn't necessarily work for everybody, but I think it worked a lot for me, where the idea is that you write down your explanation of something in your own words, and then you go back over it and you try to simplify it, and you try to find analogies and try to refine it. And that process of trying to find the right words actually changes the way you think about that subject. It reshapes the mental model you have of that topic, and eventually you'll get to a point where you just can't simplify it any further, and you could probably use that explanation to explain it to almost anybody. And what I didn't realize at the time when I started my blog was that's sort of what I was doing, because sometimes I would sit for hours editing that blog post and editing until eventually, literally, it would only be a short blog post. But what made me do that was, it wasn't just a journal that I was keeping for myself. It just wasn't private notes. Someone else was going to read this. And I started to immediately think, oh, what would that person take away from this? And how might they challenge it? And sometimes I'd throw that blog post in the bin, because I just realized the thing that I was trying to do, that I was talking about in that blog post, is not the best way of going about it. And I've now realized by writing about it. So we'd try the different thing the next day. And then as a result of doing that, I would then have a much better experience. And then I'd come back and I'd write about it again. So if you can learn in private, but if you learn in the open, you will challenge yourself more in terms of how you explain yourself. And then if you learn in the open in a way that is humble to say, this is my experience, this is what I've done so far, and always welcome feedback and comments, then it's only going to accelerate your learning, because people will then give you the feedback that you can then use and try again. And that turns into another part of the story.
absolutely. But, and I think that's a great approach, because I've never heard anybody speak to like blog writing that way. Because I that's not my strength. I'll admit it. But the concept of, it's like, okay, you have that first, I guess, draft, and then looking at it with that critical eye of an outside perspective to say, how can this be valuable to somebody else other than myself? Is really helpful to understand that perspective and making it better, right?
Yeah,
Definitely.
it pushes you knowing that someone else is going to read that, someone will criticize it. It pushes you to think about it harder. And that, I think, was what helped me. And as I said, it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. Not everybody likes to write. Some people might prefer to take their phone and record a voice note, but record it as if you're doing a podcast, and then record it again and again and improve the explanation every single time. That might be what works for someone else, as opposed to typing and editing. For another person, they might prefer talking to camera, or another person might prefer drawing pictures. Whatever works for the individual, however you find yourself best able to express an understanding of an idea that you have. If you do that in a way that you could possibly be sharing this with other people, then it will push you harder. It'll push you harder. I do that. Even I have little sketch notes from time to time that I put up on Twitter, sort of explaining my understanding of something. And I always welcome people to challenge it. It just makes the next picture even better.
Absolutely.
Actually, I don't write as much as I used to. I miss it a little bit, but I spend a lot more of my time using visuals and video now.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm going to squeeze in, unless somebody here has a question for Anthony. I'm just trying to squeeze in like a couple more questions before we run out of time. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is what goals are you currently striving for right now?
I have a few. One is, the most important one to me, is manage the transition as a father, as my son is becoming a young man and going into his first career job after his degree, and accept that I have to step back and let him fly into the world now. That is, I'm actually enjoying that process at the moment, which is really good. In terms of work, right now I'm actually focused on two things. One is helping Ford Digital create this space, that the environment that they have in their mind. They really have a very ambitious goal to create a working environment that is really very much modern, tech oriented, and attractive and inclusive to some of the best talent that we can find in and around the London area. We're starting in London in the UK, and work our way out from there, because it's the first time that I've seen any company really commit hard to creating this working environment. They've completely gone way off the usual books of any big enterprise, got completely different employment package, different offering, well away from any sort of typical corporate type environment, and they're really pushing the envelope, I think, in a lot of areas for a company that's that big and that established as a 120-year-old company. And because of what they're trying to do and create this space where there is this opportunity for people who love what they do to find joy in their work, I was really motivated to be a part of that. They came to me about it, and I first thought, oh, they want me to help in a coaching or consulting capacity. And they were like, no, we want you to be able to do stuff that we can't give you the power to do unless you're actually an employee. We want you to come and be the first employee that actually helps us build this company from the ground up. Everything from the philosophy around providing market-driven annual pay reviews, so that nobody has to come into the office with their negotiating skills, so that people are paid based on the value they deliver in their work, not how good they've got at negotiation.
Right.
The idea of providing considerably more paid holiday, up for 40 days paid annual holiday, for example, and a number of other things that are really designed about maximizing autonomy for the individuals that join the company. And we're hiring software engineers at the moment, and that's my big goal, is to really help them prove that you can do this stuff that we read about in the books, whether it's Joy Inc. or in Maverick or the 7-Day Weekend with Ricardo Semler, that you can actually make those things happen under the umbrella of a big corporate. And I think their ambition to do that aligns with my passion to make it a reality. And then on the side, I have a couple of YouTube channels where one of which is about me and my son and our adventures in our area of common interest, which is cars and motorsport. So we kind of vlog our adventures as we go to different events in different cars, usually quite interesting ones. And my other channel, which is a collaboration channel with another YouTuber that we started a while back under his brand, because it helped us engage with some of the car manufacturers a bit better. But yeah, growing those is the other thing I'm doing on the side. My channel, Sports and Touring, I have with my son. We just passed 1 million views a couple of months ago, and our biggest video to date will hit 300,000 views sometime in the next few hours. So those are also the things that I want to get to the point where, you know, where I get to do what I'm doing in the Agile community, and I get to do stuff, the creative video film production that I do in that area, and make a living doing these things that I enjoy, but not necessarily have to do any one of them full time, not necessarily give myself entirely to one or the other anymore.
Awesome. Well, we're almost out of time, and I just wanted to check with you. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want everyone to know about you or your experiences?
I think we've covered most things that I would have expected to share. But I think for me, the main thread of my personal journey has been one where there's many things that have happened that I never expected to happen. And there's this word that always sort of rings in my ears, which is one of my favorite words, and that's serendipity. You know, the happy accidents, the accidents that happen that have a good outcome. And it's one of my favorite words because I just like the way it sounds, but also I love what it means. And so much of my life, including my career, even the YouTube channels and how they started, have generally come about by me just being open to trying things. I became an Agile coach accidentally, and there's a little story on RiverGlide TV on YouTube where it explains how I accidentally became an Agile coach, because I just happened to be one of those few people in 2005 that could say they had 5 years experience in Agile. I mean, there wasn't that many people who could do that. And that resulted in me stumbling into a really cool project, which was iPlayer, which is the BBC's streaming service, which broke new ground in terms of video streaming and achieved a level of quality in video streaming that others hadn't. But they decided they're going to embrace agility, and they'd hired Rachel Davies, who was one of the first people to really push the envelope on what you could do coaching wise. She'd been one of the early XP teams in the late 90s in the UK, and if you look up her name, if you don't know her, you'll find many things associated with her in terms of what she brought to the community, including her book with Liz Sedley on Agile coaching. And I worked with her and Liz at the BBC just before they started writing that book together. And that made me realize the impact that I could potentially have, rather than as a team member or a team lead or even a mentor on a team, what I could do through coaching. And that was kind of the beginning of me stumbling into this project. And then Rachel asked me, "Oh, could you help us out on this piece here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And I learned so much from her about coaching, what it's about. And that really set me up, I think, for what I was going to then do for the next 15 years, I suppose.
That's
So
awesome.
serendipity, listen, listen, let the happy accidents happen. And I think that applies both in our lives, in our work, and it's really the secret ingredient of innovation itself. There's an article about that on ideas.riverglide.com, and I'll share the link so that Nicole can put that in the video description when the YouTube video comes out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Antony, for taking the time to share your story with us. Thank you to April for recommending you as our referral, because I like to call it a chain of community going. So the homework I have for you, Antony, before we go, is that for whoever we spotlight, we ask that person to choose the next person that we feature. And we alternate between men and women. So you will have to spotlight a woman, Agilist, that you know that you want to have share her story here on Agile in Color. Share your story.
I'm going to challenge you. I'm
Oh.
going to challenge you, Nicole. I'm going to say, how about you become the subject and we get someone else like April to interview you on Agile in Color?
All right. Well, I didn't see that coming, but we could probably work that out. We'd have to work out some logistics on handling all of the behind the scenes stuff, but I will put that in front of the group for us to do next. But again, thank you again, Antony, for sharing your story with us. We truly appreciate it. I know everybody who's going to watch it on YouTube will appreciate and it will resonate with them. Thank you all who have joined us live for your questions, your participation, your attention. Antony's putting his channels in the chat so you can check it out. And for those who are new to the Agile community, we want you to find out that we are part of your community now. If you did not have one, please connect with us, and you will always have someone you can talk to if you're having challenge, need help, or anything like that. I will also put my LinkedIn in the chat if we are not already connected. So thank you all. Have a great Thursday. And thank you again, Antony. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's
Thank you
wonderful.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.